Well, thank you all so much for joining with us for Ask Me Anything, which is a part of our Freedom to Parent 21st Century Children or Kids. And we are so elated to have two amazing speakers to talk about faith and reproductive freedom. Oftentimes, people are like, you can't talk about religion and politics at the same time, or either one, but you know what? We're going to do it today. And so we have an amazing panel. This might have to be part of a series or something like that, because there's no way we can encompass in 1 hour all the brevity of what it means to talk about faith and reproductive freedom or reproductive justice. And so I want to introduce our speakers right now. And so I'm going to start with the biography of Rabbi Emily Cohen. Is a spiritual leader of West End Synagogue. Born in Virginia, Rabbi Emily experienced a California accented Southern Jewish upbringing, moved to Minnesota for her undergraduate degree in Macalester College, and pursued rabbinic ordination at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia. In 2001, Rabbi Emily was named one of the New York Jewish Week's 36 under 36 activists, and she is lefty in multiple ways and lives in Brooklyn with her partner and the world's best cat. We got a lot of cat parents in the building, so let's give a big ups to Rabbi Emily and Reverend Amanda Hambrick Ashcraft, pronouns she, her, is the founder of Raising Imagination, a movement towards progressive collective social and spiritual change. She's a nationally known public theologian at the intersection of religion, politics, and parenting, and is on the clergy advisory of Planned Parenthood, Empire State Acts, and is a consulting community minister at Middle Collegiate Church. She lives in Manhattan with 4 kids. I'm still like, the 4 kids piece is so amazing. Husband and goldfishes, silver and wild. Regardless if you're a parent or not, we care about kids. And this is a part of our AMA, Ask Me Anything, is a part of the Freedom to Parent 21st Century Kids. And you don't have to be a parent for 21st century children to care and give a damn about what's happening. We have aunties, grandmas, trusted adults that are a part of our community, and that's what we really want to center today. And so let's go ahead and get in, ladies. Let's go ahead and talk. So how did you all get involved in ministry, in being a reverend or a rabbi? Like, what was your path to get there?
Hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here with my colleague, Reverend Amanda, and with Ray, and with all of you. This is a question that I think most clergy get often, and I'm going to give you the 1-minute version, which is that ultimately I became a rabbi to help people feel more connected and to help people feel more like they're part of a community and less set apart from one another, which I think is all too easy in the 21st century. And so, for people, just in case there's anybody that is unfamiliar with this, there are a lot of different Jewish movements, denominations, and in some, there's a lot of rabbis who are women, and others there are not. But the movement that I'm in has had a history of women in leadership and non-binary folks in leadership for a long time. And so I am proud to be one of those rabbis who was able to become a part of the Jewish community and Jewish leadership. And so I'm really glad to be here with Reverend Amanda, and I'm going to turn it over to her to just say hello.
Thank you, Emily. It's nice to see you, and Ray, it's good to see you again. And I'm really grateful to be here. Can y'all hear me okay? Okay. I'm really grateful to be here with you all and everyone who's joining us from all over the country. It's very, very exciting. How did I get into ministry? I am an ordained Baptist minister. I'll start by saying that I was ordained because of my love for community, ritual, and the prophetic witness of the brown, unhoused refugee, Rabbi Jesus. I believe that Jesus's story and the story of a God who loves all people and wants us to work alongside her to redeem the world is a powerful one. I do not come to ministry with the belief that this is something that is the only way that someone might experience of love or justice or divineness or even spirituality. I think that there are many ways to the divine, and I think that God's big enough, and however you define her, to hold them all. And I'm really excited to explore this specific conversation with you all this evening.
Well, thanks to you both, Reverend Amanda and Rabbi Emily, for giving us such an artful and amazing introduction to yourselves. And so we're going to dive in. I'm going to do like a little interview, and then we'll also be able to dive into the chat. We've also had some pre-selected questions that we will intertwine in our responses for our session today. And so I want to really dive right in. What do you think the role faith has in politics, and what is that in your experience related to reproductive freedom and reproductive justice?
I happened to have a conversation with a congregant of mine last week where we were talking about ritual and we were talking about social activism, and he was saying that it's so important to him that we have ritual, and that's like what makes Judaism a special religion. And I mean, not that other religions don't have ritual, but that our particular rituals are what are unique to Judaism and make Judaism so special. And I was saying, I completely agree with you. And for me, having that ritual is what allows me to feel empowered to be out in the world with my activism, and my activism is what helps me to feel empowered within the synagogue and within the Jewish community to really sit in that ritual. And so each one informs the other. And there are, some folks who only really engage in faith through social justice, especially in the Jewish community. There's a large number of folks who might not belong to a synagogue and might not be part of a traditional Jewish community, but are really engaged in the work of Tikkun Olam, in the work of repairing the world. And I want to bring those folks into shul, and I want to bring the folks in my shul out to the streets. So for me, there really isn't faith without justice, and there isn't really justice without faith. They have to go together, and that's really the work that I see. And with reproductive justice in particular, we can get into a lot more specifics, and I imagine that we will over the next time that we have together. But with reproductive justice, as someone who is a young bi pan woman married to a man, as it turns out, but also somebody dealing with infertility concerns right now, this is something that hits me really close to home, because I know that I may need access to an abortion if, when my partner and I, if we are lucky enough to conceive, if it's not a fetus that could be safely carried to term, that's something we may need, especially for older moms. And I also know that if I needed that, I would have access, and I want to make sure that every single person has that same access, because it feels like if I'm not advocating for everybody, then I have no right to advocate for myself.
Wow. Okay, Rabbi Emily, that's a real strong testimony, and it resonates with me on so many levels. I'm so excited to hear from Reverend Amanda.
Yes, Emily, Rabbi, I'm sitting with so much of what you just said. Thank you for sharing all that and your vulnerability and honesty. I love talking faith in politics, if that wasn't already clear. And I know that even putting those two words together is, to some, a really uncomfortable juxtaposition. And so I like to start off by saying, like right off the bat, that I am unequivocal in my belief in the separation of church and state and in instilling our First Amendment rights. And in the same body, same voice, same breath, I know, and statistically we know that people's faith and religious values impact and dictate their voting habits. Isn't that interesting? So here we can like be full proponents of the separation of church and state, and at the same time, just like go ahead and claim that for a lot of people, religion and faith values impact the voting booth. And so the question that I am so interested in is how does our faith, and whatever way we've come to claim one, if we have one, how does our faith impact our voting habits? Because we know that they do. If our faith tradition teaches us to love our neighbor, for example, then we are probably going to vote for the person who we think is making laws that will love our neighbor. Now, to us around this screen, the way that we are going to vote and think about a question framed like that seems fairly obvious, right? There's some candidates out there who are doing some damn good loving, and there are some who are damn not doing that. And we know that we are facing an onslaught of messaging and policies right now that are largely fueled by people who claim to be Christian, but in fact are spewing hate and violence towards many groups, namely groups who aren't white, male, straight Christians. So this conversation that we're having right now that can talk and help people who are also faithful and help us articulate how our faith informs our progressive politics and votes is really, really important. Of course, reproductive justice is a huge political issue. It's been a wedge issue in many elections in the past. We know with the recent overturning of Roe that it is still top of mind. We see different articles and amendments that have been passed in several states already as we're leading up to 2024. So, I want to echo what Rabbi Emily said. To me, the conversation of faith and politics go hand in hand, even as we are staunch proponents of the separation of church and state.
Absolutely. And I agree with both of you wholeheartedly. And as someone who grew up in a Baptist and Jewish home, I am really excited to have this conversation today. And I just really want to make sure that we hone in on prescient issues, because I think that folks have a lot of conversations about there's supposed to be a separation. There's supposed to be a separation between denominations and faiths and X, Y, and Z. But I want to know from you all, why is it important for faith leaders to advocate in their communities for justice, for equity, for inclusion, for diversity? What is your perspective on doing such things, and why are you called to do it?
That's a great question, Ray. And I hear that as a little bit of a more meta question than just the specific, conversation of Roe. So I'll maybe try to do both as we do reproductive justice as well. I see the person of Jesus as a political person. I see Jesus in his the parables and in what we see of his ministry as always looking out for the oppressed, as always looking out for the poor, for women, for the outcast, as living and embodying an unquestionable theology of abundance rather than a theology of scarcity. And those things are political because if we are going to talk about how, what does it look like to follow someone who cares about the poor, then our policies need to reflect policies that care about the poor. What does that look like? That maybe looks like healthcare. That maybe looks like making sure we are raising a minimum wage. That looks like making sure we have paid medical and family and bereavement leave. There's so many ways that we can take the pillars of our faith and apply them fairly easily to politics and to policy. And so for me to say that I am a Christian and that furthermore I am an ordained minister, and to not be able to articulate why doing justice is important doesn't it's hypocritical. Micah 6:8, what does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love kindly, and to walk humbly with your God. That is a verse that has always been a pillar of my faith. And justice can look like so many different things, but to me, it looks like walking and working alongside a living and breathing God to create the world that God imagines. One where all have enough, where all can be fed, where everyone, no matter how they look or who they love, is protected under the law, but is also cared for and seen and is able to thrive. And then let me just say maybe a little bit more about how that kind of specifically breaks down to reproductive justice for me, and then I'll toss it to Rabbi Emily. The term reproductive justice comes to us through the Sister Song Collective. It came to us in 1994. They are a Black woman-led organization out of Georgia. I lift them up to you all, and I think it's important that we understand the fullness and the richness of the term reproductive justice that those Black women gave to us. And it is essentially the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children, to not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And so if we sit with that definition, that is a very intersectional definition, to use the word that Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw gave to us. Now, the word intersectional is nowhere in the Bible, but if we read the stories and if we follow the person of Jesus, and if we study the long story of God throughout the Bible, we see a very intersectional person of Jesus. We see Jesus speaking to the Samaritan woman and really seeing her for all of who she is, her race, her class, her gender, and breaking through all of that and saying, I see you, and actually you can preach and you can teach and you're kind of a badass. And so when I take that intersectional definition of reproductive justice, and when I take the issue of abortion here or whatever social justice issue it is, I'm also wanting to make sure that I'm applying an intersectional theology to how I'm approaching that issue. That means I'm never going to look at that issue by itself, right? I'm never just going to say, okay, what does this one, issue mean in some kind of like vacuum? But I'm going to do what I see the intersectional Jesus doing, which is say, who's left out of this conversation? Who's most hurt by this conversation? Who's not around the table? What else is at play here? And when we do that with abortion, then we begin to see, wow, who's really going to be the most hurt? Who is the most impacted now that Roe is overturned? Well, we know who it is, and they don't look like me, right? They are Black and brown and trans and non-binary people, pregnant people. They are people who have been the most impacted by laws that are not advocating for reproductive justice and bodily autonomy all the time. They are poor people. They are people who are not able to access the same type of medical care, and not just medical care for a pregnant person, but care for the baby after the baby is born. And so this is the conversation of reproductive justice is this extremely loaded and intersectional one that has so much more to do than just the question of when does life begin, and just the question of, who should be deciding what should happen to this fetus, because it hits on what happens to that child, what happens to the pregnant person, what happens to the communities that the child is brought into or not long after the child is born. It is a very loaded and full conversation. And I think our faith traditions show us the necessity to be able to hold all of that.
Oh, you gave us a little piece of sermon, and it really was touching my heart. I was about to be like, is the doors of the church open? I was ready to join your church. Rabbi Emily, I'm so excited to see your part of the situation, because so often I think that folks want to pit Christians versus Jews, especially particularly on this issue, and it's political, but we're talking about birthing bodies. We're talking about folks needing access and folks needing care more now more than ever, especially with the Dobbs decision in the fall of Roe. And so I am so excited to hear your perspective on reproductive justice and the roles of rabbis in that space.
Thank you. And I could listen to Reverend Amanda preach all day. So thank you. Beautiful words and very powerful. I'm going to say a few things that are all kind of interconnected with a major like +1 to everything that Reverend Amanda just said. First, I got to talk about Christian hegemony for a second. When we talk about how people are fake Christians, if somebody's a Christian, they're a Christian. You might not agree with their politics. You might not like the way that they take Christianity and put it in the world. But if you've got ordained ministers saying things in the name of Christianity, you have to be able to hold that as part of your mess to clean up, in the same way that as a white person, I have to hold racism as my mess to clean up. And you know, this is something that I hear a lot, that like, and especially from my Christian colleagues, not like, you know, not obviously Reverend Amanda, but I hear from other folks that like, you know, oh, like there are these fake Christians out there. And I just got to say, in the same way that I wince sometimes when I hear what other Jews say about certain things, and I'm going to get to that in a second, they're still part of the Jewish community. And my role as a rabbi is to show that there are multiple ways of approaching this. So wanted to begin with that because I think it's important to name the full face of this and know that when we're talking about any of these complex issues, it's going to involve getting into issues that can be a little bit thorny even amongst friends. And it's only by calling one another in that we can hopefully work through those issues and make our world better. And that is the ultimate goal. So Judaism. The one thing I can say definitively about the Jewish community is that we do not have a single answer to any question. So this whole idea of what does Judaism say about abortion? What does Judaism say about reproductive rights? I can tell you a lot of things that Judaism says, but more importantly, I can tell you my interpretation. So I come from a tradition of thousands of years of wrestling with text. I come from a tradition that says that you have to look at the Torah, you have to look at these words, and you have to make sense of them. There's this notion of black fire on white fire, the black fire being the physical, you know, written words, and the white fire being everything that's not on the page or on the parchment that we have to understand. So there are absolutely Jews who are not for reproductive justice, who do not believe in reproductive choice, and who would say that abortion is almost in all cases something that should not be permitted, and that birth control in most cases should not be permitted. There are absolutely Jews like that. Those are my equivalents of the fake Christians. They're the people that are part of my faith, they're part of my community, they may have their reasons for believing as they do, and I'm hoping to bring a different perspective. With that being said, there are a lot of things within Jewish text that support giving everybody reproductive freedom. So I'm going to bring in actually a couple of texts. The first is from Exodus 21, 22 to 25. And so this is something that's common to both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible. So when men fight, and just to say, this is rendered in the binary because it's you know, ancient Hebrew, and that's what we're dealing with here. So when men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. You get the idea. So what a lot of Jews and a lot of our like most famous commentators from about 1,000 years ago have to say about this is that it shows that a fetus is not life. A fetus is not yet life. So a miscarriage may ensue. It might be a crime. The person who caused the miscarriage might need to pay a penalty, but it is not something that is to be treated in the same way that the loss of life would be. When we get to the Mishnah, which was really the first writing down of the oral tradition of Judaism, so like that white fire I was talking about, that interpretation, it gets a lot more explicit. So I'm going to read this little passage for Mishnah Holot, and that this shows pretty clearly that there are circumstances where abortion is not only permitted but required in Jewish text. If a woman is having trouble giving birth, they cut up the child in her womb and bring it forth limb by limb, because her life comes before its life. But if the greater part has come out, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for that of another. So what the rabbis make of this text is that basically until a time in labor when a baby is crowning, until it is coming out into the world, the mother's life always has to come first. The pregnant person's life always has to come first. And some would say that that means that abortion is only acceptable in situations where there is danger to the life of the pregnant person. But there's also a lot in Jewish text about what constitutes danger. There is physical danger, of course, the idea that the pregnant person could die. But there's also the idea that the person who's pregnant, that the potential parent, could have intense mental distress because perhaps they do not know how they will feed their child. They have so many children that they don't know how they would take care of an additional child. They have an abusive partner from whom they need to get away, and they will not be able to do that with a child. There's a lot that we can put in there about other reasons that abortion may not only be acceptable, but even required. So I bring this in because I think sometimes you have to fight text with text, and especially when we're looking at an issue like abortion, which really became a religious issue when the Republican Party decided that the way to activate evangelical Christians was to activate them around this issue of abortion. It's important that we as the religious left can use the same kind of arguments that the folks on the religious right can use. I'm not trying to say that the religious right doesn't exist. I'm not trying to say that the religious left should always be in charge, but I do think that for those of us who are connected to faith, we have not only the opportunity, but the obligation to use what's available to us within our traditions to fortify our resolve and to get us out onto the streets, because it took the religious right 50 years to overturn Roe. And I don't want it to take us 50 years to get it back in place again.
Thank you for that. I'm like, y'all have deeply moved me, and I know our congregation, we have gathered here tonight for this event. And so we have a lot of thoughts to process and sit with that you both shared in that first section. And so I want to move to a space of like, how do we get activated? How do we use faith to get activated? How can community members support the various faith traditions in our community? How do we work in tandem with other faith traditions? I mean, I know Amanda grew up in a Baptist background, much like myself. I do have some Jewish ancestry, which is a whole nother conversation for a different day. And so it's great to have both parts of myself here in conversation today. But like, how would you recommend community members support the efforts of you who are a reverend and a rabbi who've invested your whole lives into this work?
Ray, is it okay before I jump there if I can do a little of the like text on text like Rabbi Emily did from some more
Oh yeah, we got time. We got 22 minutes. So yeah, let's do it.
I'll do, and again, this is all so quickly, but Ray was able to send Rabbi Emily and I some of your all's questions that you submitted. And in, a quick scan of those, I did see one common theme was, but how do we do this? Like, how do we talk to other faithful friends? I was picking up on a lot of questions around Catholicism and how do we talk to, Catholics about abortion And, also to say I am only one voice, but I have thought and studied about my voice and worked out my theology specifically around this issue for a long time and continue to do it every day, and encourage you all to do that as well. And that actually is one of the ways that I think we can support one another, is to encourage conversations like this, where we can work out our theology and read the text and pick them up and say, if somebody's weaponizing this or like really holding this over my head, is there anything that I can say? And so I'm happy to share with you all kind of some of the ways that I've worked that out in hopes that that is helpful. One of them is I really believe that anyone's decision to have an abortion is a faith-informed way to live into a full, abundant, rich lives, to which I believe we are all called to live. There's a scripture in John 10:10 that says, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So if we believe that we are all called to live abundant life, and this is an abortion is for whatever reason, something that is necessary or wanted for a person at any time in their life, that's a way that someone is living into a faithful, abundant life to which that they are called. The Holy Bible reminds us also that we have moral agency, kind of along with that we are called to co-create with God, and that we are designed for freedom in that, the freedom to choose. I love your freedom to parent. Those things are not exempt from our divine call. We are made in the image of the holy and of the beloved, and in that we have moral agency and we have freedom to choose. Galatians 5:13, for we are called to freedom. And there is a very important thing that pro-life, which is a scam, and we know that, and that's been a word that's been monopolized and weaponized and used, as Rabbi Emily pointed out, as a brilliant marketing plan, when there are countless examples of the religious Christian evangelicals who actually were for abortion and who supported Planned Parenthood and other initiatives before there was an intentionally racially coded attack to use babies as a way to keep schools racially segregated. And I posted an article in that. But so mainstream Christianity a lot of times fails to remember that even Mary, the mother of Jesus, when she is told, you are going to bear a son, do we remember what Mary does in that moment? She finds out she is pregnant in Luke chapter 1, and she responds, yes. Let everything you said happen to me. Y'all, she accepted it. She chose it. And I know that may be some like out there theology in a way that you're hearing like an interpretation of that for the first time. And that's okay. I don't mean to be pushing that on you. I'm not forcing it on you, but that is a way that I have come to understand that even in right there in the Bible, we have an example of Mary choosing and saying, okay, let this happen. So there are absolutely, I think, biblical ways that Christians can use scripture as well to defend a reproductive justice and pro-abortion stance, if that is something that they would like to do. So now I'll tap on your answer and then I'll pass it to Emily. It was essentially like, what can we do to support this type of conversation in the public square, kind of. Again, I do think these types of conversations are so important, because I tell that story in that article that I posted in here and that Rabbi Emily mentioned about the racist roots of the formation of the religious right so often. And I tell it in so many spaces, and the majority of people are hearing it for the first time. And yes, friends, if we do not know the origins of how these fascists have been molding our minds and our moral imaginations, and therefore our policies, then we are never going to be able to out-organize them. We absolutely have to understand where these stories, where these narratives, why all of a sudden is pro-life equated with Christianity. Why, how did that happen? We have to be able to peel that back and understand all of the different layered intersectional roots of how this happens, because that is a tool for organizing and being able to articulate our faith and why as a rabbi, right? As a reverend, why as a person of faith, why as a spiritual person, if that's how you identify, why you vote with those values. How can you articulate that is so, so, so important, because guess what? The right does that very, very well. They've been doing that, and we have shied away a lot of people, not all. I think that's another false narrative out there. There have always been progressive people of faith doing this work and being involved in this. There's always been a religious left that's been out there, but we need to work harder and louder on lifting up that voice and countering the message that people of faith only vote one way.
Absolutely, Reverend Amanda. And I'm really excited to hear the response from Rabbi Emily. And I would just like to say that there's a word that you use that I've been very afraid to use in our platforms, which is fascism. And I looked it up in Merriam-Webster and also Britannica, and it's like a political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual, and that stands for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader with severe economic and social regimentation and forcible suppression. And so I think that's what we're talking about when we talk about, no matter how somebody identifies politically, fascism is what we're dealing with. And the fact that I feel better about saying that word now, since you've said it in religious context, is breathtaking. And I'm definitely going to have some time to process and think through that. But Rabbi Emily, I know you're going to hit us with some hot fire before we get to these questions that we got in the chat or that we already have. Otherwise, we're going to make an amalgamation of them. But I want you to give your due to what Reverend Amanda just said. And I know y'all are both in community together, and I would love to be able to talk about how you all maybe worked together previously before this particular session.
Well, that's actually where I was going to pick up, is that, you know, like when Reverend Man is talking about like how you have to be in coalition and you have to be like working with other people of faith, certainly absolutely is the case within a faith community. So like there is a group called the National Council of Jewish Women that has created this organization called Rabbis for Repro, although it's for rabbis and cantors, which are the main ordained clergy within the Jewish community. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of rabbis across the country and cantors who have signed on to not only advocate and do events, you know, like this is sort of part of my work with Rabbis for Repro, but also within their own synagogues. So there's a Repro Shabbat once a year, Shabbat being our weekly Sabbath. And, you know, I will every year, if I can, do a sermon that's on the topic of reproductive justice. It's aligned with a particular part of the Torah that is often used to demonstrate why there is textual support for reproductive freedom. And it's something that I know I'm held by many other colleagues when I do this work. And the more of us who do it, the easier it is for others to do it. And so that's true within communities, but just as much, if not more so, across communities. So, you know, I think Reverend Amanda and I met, I think it was just after or just before Roe fell. I think we'd followed each other online, but we didn't meet in person until a protest in Foley Square and or somewhere like that. And that's been something that in New York City, we're lucky to have a pretty wide coalition of clergy who care very deeply about this issue. And again, because we're in New York, many of us are fortunate enough to be able to be active around this issue without fear of losing our jobs. And I think it's important to name that because it's real on a number of issues that can be called political. And let's be real, like, I mean, abortion is a political issue. It is a very important issue about which I have very strong feelings and I'm willing to speak out about them. But I do have colleagues who are in parts of the country or in particular congregations where they feel that they have to be much more subtle in their approach. So if you are in a place where you can be loud, I recommend being loud, and I recommend being loud in interfaith coalitions. So how do you do that? It might mean reaching out if if you happen to have people in your community that are part of a different faith community, not people that you've never met, but like people that you already kind of have some connection with. You might ask them if their place of worship is doing anything around this issue. You might consider going to a town hall or something similar and seeing who might be there from different faith communities and who you might be able to connect with. And then what happens from there, like in New York, we have a Signal chat, among other things, an app that we use to mobilize when things happen. We have email lists, and there's just a trust that builds over time, such that when I got this email from Amanda saying, hey, are you free to do this event with this organization I've been connected with, I trusted her enough to say, yeah, sure, I'm happy to do this. And I'm so glad I did. But it came from this relationship that was already in place. So you gotta get to know your neighbors. And that's something that, going way back to the beginning of this conversation, that's something that I think is harder to do now than it may have been before social media, before so much of our lives was spent in front of a screen. And that's where it begins, and it's vulnerable work. And I think that work is also sacred. And I think that work is ultimately what's going to help all of us to try to see one another, because it will remind us that we are indeed all built in that divine reflection. And that's so important as a baseline.
Wow. Thanks so much for sharing that, Rabbi Emily. And I want to open it up. I know we've gotten a lot of questions that we already saw that you all were able to process and digest, but I want Julie to come on screen and let us know what happened down in the chat or the DMs. And
well, it's been great and active for sure. The next question is, how do we respond to, you cannot be a Christian and progressive because Jesus didn't want us to kill babies?
You picked such a great question. It's a question that everybody probably, if you've ever had this conversation about abortion, reproductive justice, you've been asked that question. And I tell a story of, I was up at the Supreme Court, right? After Dobbs. So it was like in the December where we knew like Roe was coming. This was kind of the last stake. And I had on my collar, and I'm like very clearly, pro-abortion, like minister. And I'm standing, right beside all of the other ministers and people and Christians who are with the fetuses and the god-awful pictures of the unborn babies and all those things. And I just always go back to that moment where it's like two people of faith standing beside each other with like very different ways that we've come to understand how to vote and how to live out our faith with policy and social issues. And I was asked repeatedly that day by young men who had been like bussed there from all over the country. They just kept sticking microphones in my face. They wanted to get a soundbite. They wanted to record and would say, when does life begin? Why do you for killing babies? And I knew they were just trying to rile me up and get a soundbite. And I finally, for one of them, I stepped back and I said, I think you're asking the wrong question. Mm-hmm. And honestly, that is my response right now too. I'm not a scientist. I'm not in the medical profession. I'm a human, and I'm a minister, and I'm a person asking questions and trying to figure out this life just like everyone else. Mm-hmm. And when you ask that poignant question, and when that's what you focus on, that's when I think you lose what we were talking about before, which is this is an intersectional, layered conversation. Mm-hmm. And we actually can't ask that question in a vacuum. Right. Because if we're going to ask that, we're also needing to ask who's feeding that baby, who's providing healthcare for that baby, who's making sure that that baby has books to read that aren't banned, that baby has resources that are in their school to make it just and equitable so that it's not a school to prison pipeline. Right. So it's the wrong question to ask is actually what I say. And as people of faith, if we can understand a fluid and intersectional and layered God of justice, we will begin to see that.
Are there specifics of reproductive justice that speak to men? How do we bring them alongside us?
I can speak to this from a Jewish perspective a bit. Judaism is built around patriarchy. There's a great deal of feminism within Judaism, both ancient and modern, and it's becoming more and more reclaimed, which is wonderful. But it is still, in a lot of its iterations across time, it has been a patriarchal religion. And so when we are talking about reproductive justice in the Jewish community, I like to remind men that they are the people to whom the Torah was written. So Hebrew is a gendered language. And while this is something that frustrates me deeply, the truth of the matter is that the Torah was written in the masculine you. So Hebrew does not have a gender inclusive you in the way that we do in English. It's either masculine or feminine. And there's been some really interesting modern Hebrew things that have happened to try to make it less gendered. But the Torah was written about and to men for the most part. And so they have to be a part of this conversation. And I can use that just as a way to bring them in. The other thing I would say is that, as long as we are in a society, which is also a patriarchy, where women and like the bodies that many women inhabit have been really penalized at every level, from paying taxes on tampons to not being able to get parental leave when you've gone through the equivalent of surgery in giving a birth. I'm a relatively new auntie. I loved that reference to aunties earlier. My sister has an 11-month-old, and I know what that was like for her to carry and birth that baby, having been with her for a lot of it. And it's something that if you are somebody who cares about the world, if you are a man who cares about the world, you need to be a man who cares about women and non-binary folk and trans folk in this world, because the world was built so much more for you than for them.
Emily, woo, that was your sermon right there.
So that you answered that. So along the way, you guys answered some of these, which is great. So how do you approach your rabbis and pastors who say that they just want to be nonpartisan, but they clearly talk about political issues all the time, but they just want to be nonpartisan and they don't want to get involved in this discussion? What do you say to them?
I can start there. We hit on this a little bit before. I think you can start with any issue or any tenet of your faith and ask, okay, if a tenet of your faith is to love your neighbor, if a tenet of your faith is to do justice, if a tenet of your faith is to care for the poor, if a tenet of your faith is to, I don't know, fill in the blank, those are some big three there, then how does that relate to who you're going to vote for? You don't have to tell people who to vote for. And we actually know that we can't do that, right? Like as rabbis and as clergy and as religious institutions, we cannot do that. But we can say, here is how we understand our faith to impact what's happening right now at a political level. Here's how we can tell the stories that are in our holy texts. And then we can basically say, look, it's up to you to decide what love looks like in this situation. It's up to you to figure out what justice looks like in this situation. But if we articulate very clear examples of what we understand love to look like in justice, look what I just did. Now Cornel West is running for president. He's the one who said that, but you know what I mean? Love is what justice looks like in public. But we don't have to do partisan politics to still be able to preach gospels, to preach sermons, to preach messages that will inform people's voting habits.
So last one real quick. I know we only have really a minute left, but someone asked about a rural community that only has one hospital that's Catholic and restricts many reproductive services. Do you have any thoughts on approaching reproductive justice for their county?
This is really practical. Can you raise money? Can you get people money that they might need to access reproductive care outside of that area? There's a lot of abortion funds that cover not only the costs of providing abortions to folks who need them, but also the travel costs. In New York, we're lucky enough to be in a state where it's pretty easy, relatively speaking, to access reproductive care, but that doesn't mean that we don't have access, or that we aren't trying to raise money to get people to come to us to have the care that they need to be able to get abortions, or in some cases, not even abortions, but just other forms of reproductive care that are not available to them in their place. So if you can always do money. And if you can't, you can maybe organize to get others to do that. But I think if it's one Catholic hospital, you may not be able to change the policies, at least not right now. That's my guess.
All right.
One other quick thing right there too, and I've learned so much about this from Rabbi Emily. I think too, as people of faith and as organizations that are faithful, we can also show that we're compassionate and that we care. And we can provide spaces for rage if we need to rage, and spaces for collective grief if we need to do that. For a lot of people, for some people, considering these types of medical procedures, going through them, they want to process. They want to be in conversation with someone that they trust. Faith communities are those places. So make sure that you are open about, hey, you can come here and do this. I can walk you through this. I can be here with you. Showing up also as abortion escorts. There's so many ways that we can do that.
This has been really, really informative. So many great comments and things in the chat. People are very appreciative of you guys being here tonight. I'm very appreciative of this conversation. This was great. So thank you very, very much.
I'm deeply indebted to both Reverend Amanda and Rabbi Emily. I know that folks want this conversation to continue, so I will give you all of the things, and I hope that both Reverend Amanda and Rabbi Emily consider coming back, because I already see that folks want you to come back. I already have people emailing me already, and so I hope you'll be in community with us. But we just want to thank you, and we're so grateful for you giving us the real deal on what spirituality and faith and reproductive justice means to you and your community, and how you got to it, and what we can do to move forward. And so I ask everyone on this call to sit with it, everything that was shared, and process and think about everything that was shared, because not everything can be synthesized in the moment that it was shared by both Reverend Amanda or Rabbi Emily. Is something that we have to sit with, no matter if you're a person of faith or not. I think there were a lot of concepts that traverse emotional intelligence, spirituality, religion, processing what our society is going through in the present moment. And so I wish peace and love and joy and abundance for everybody who's been a part of this conversation or who watches this recording. And so with that being said, I'll see you all on Beyonce's internet another time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.